In this video, I'll cover the Home Assistant configuration file, including how it is structured and why you may want to consider a split file alternative. Then I'll show the step-by-step process and options for splitting your own configuration. Hi, and welcome to Resin Chem Tech. Now, love it or hate it, YAML is the language used for Home Assistant configuration files. Not too long ago, nearly everything in Home Assistant, from integration of devices to creation of dashboards, had to be done by manually editing YAML files. Nowadays, the new UI editors shield you from a lot of that YAML by creating the YAML for you through a nice user interface. But even if you're new to Home Assistant, it won't be too long before you'll have a need to manually edit these configuration files. It might be to add a new theme, or it might be to integrate a device that doesn't have a native integration, or even to adapt a project that someone else has done by providing the YAML files like I do in a lot of my projects. With a couple newer exceptions for the UI-generated automations and scripts, by default, everything with your configuration goes into one big file, configuration.yaml. Everything you need or want to change manually about your configuration goes into this file. Over time, this configuration file can grow to thousands of lines of code. This makes it a maintenance nightmare to try to find, edit, and even add new integrations or entities. Luckily, we can split out sections of this into individual files to make maintenance and future growth more manageable, shrinking that original configuration.yaml down to just a few dozen lines of code or even less. If you're new to Home Assistant, you might think that a split configuration isn't something you need right now, but it's much easier to start with a split configuration up front than it is to try to migrate thousands of lines of code down the road. Believe me, I'm speaking from personal experience here. So even if you're relatively new, you can set up your configuration in this split format now to make your life much easier down the road. Now, this video is not meant to be a YAML tutorial, but there are a couple of concepts you need to be aware of when we go to split our configuration. First and foremost is indentation, when you're talking about YAML, is always two spaces. This is one of the big complaints about YAML. It's very strict about this. One space or three spaces, and you're going to get an error. So it's always two spaces whenever there's indentation. Do note that a tab is not the same as spaces. So a lot of times an editor will auto indent for you when you're typing in your code. You need to make sure that your editor is not inserting a tab. You might need to look for settings somewhere or something like that to say, make sure that you're using spaces and not a tab. If you end up with a tab in there, you're going to get an error again, and it's going to be very, very difficult to find. So always make sure you're using two spaces and not a tab whenever doing indentation. The other concept we need to be aware of are lists versus dictionaries, or as they are termed officially in Home Assistant, mappings. And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail here. Just realize that each item in a list is preceded by a hyphen, where each key value pair in a dictionary is just indented by those two spaces without a hyphen. Yes, this can be very confusing, but I'll show you why this is important when we get into actually splitting the configuration. Just realize that if it has dashes in front of it, it's a list. If it doesn't, it's a dictionary. To make things a little bit even more confusing, in some cases, Home Assistant will accept either one for the same thing. So here's an example of an automation action as a list, and here it is as a mapping. Both of those are valid when there's only one service or action present. Now, the recommended way is to use it as a list shown here on the left. Theoretically, either one of those will work. Again, we don't have to worry about right now how to actually create these things. It can be very confusing. Just realize that when we're splitting the configuration, we just need to be aware of whether we are splitting out something that is a list or something that is a mapping. For now, that's all you really need to know about YAML and how it's structured for the purposes of splitting out your configuration. Next, you're going to need some sort of text editor to be able to split your configuration. Now, if you've already got a text editor installed in Home Assistant, feel free to use the timeline to skip this section. But if you're new, I'll show you a few different text editors that you can use both in Home Assistant and externally. Now, if you need a text editor, there are a couple of options right within Home Assistant that you can use. We go to our add-ons and our add-on store. One of the first and easiest options is called File Editor. This is something that's integrated right into Home Assistant. You can see I've got it installed over here already. And it allows you to open, edit, change your configuration files. So it's a pretty simple option, but it's also very easy to install and use. Next option is something called Studio Code Server. What this will do is actually gives you a Visual Studio add-on within Home Assistant that you can use with your configuration files. The nice thing about this, it does have auto completion, so it will show you all of your entities. It also does some basic syntax checking. The only thing to be aware of was last time I tried this, I was still running on a Raspberry Pi 3B. This is pretty resource intensive and it really slowed down that Raspberry Pi 3. I've not tried it in a while, and odds are if you're using a Raspberry Pi 4 or something like Home Assistant Yellow, something with a little more horsepower, it would probably be fine. But just be aware that if you are on a Raspberry Pi 3, this might make your system somewhat sluggish. But if you don't like either of those options, you can also install what's called the Samba add-on. And what this will allow you to do is actually map a drive to your Home Assistant configuration folder to your local PC. And from that point, you can use any type of editor that you want. In my case, I use a lot of times something like Notepad++, but you can use any editor, including a full Visual Studio experience, connect your files remotely and edit them that way. In this particular video, I'm going to be using a combination of the internal file editor and Notepad++. Now, one final thing before we actually get started splitting the configuration file is you want to make sure you have a current backup of Home Assistant. Now, I recommend not only doing a full backup, but also making a copy of your current configuration.yaml file. Yes, that's included in the backup, but it's a tar file and you have to unpack a bunch of it to get to it. It could be handy just to have a copy of your configuration.yaml. So if you're using Samba, just copy that file. If you're using a text editor, just copy the contents of your current configuration.yaml file over to a new text document and just save that off somewhere. And of course, if you're using Proxmox, it's even easier. You can just take a quick snapshot of your system. But you also want to make backups along the way, so in case something does get messed up, you don't have to go all the way back to the very beginning. Okay, if you've got good backups, let's start splitting the configuration file. To show you how this works, I'm going to use two separate text editors here. Now, that's not required. It can make your life a little bit easier, but to make it easier to see here on the screen, I'm going to use the built-in file editor, and I'm going to use an external editor, which in my case is Notepad++. So what we're going to look to split out are these top-level integrations. So this is my Home Assistant configuration file. All of my general configuration stuff is up here, but what we're going to look to split out are these top-level integrations. Now, what I mean by that, a top-level integration will always be fully left justified and have a colon. So things like lights, switches, sensors, in this case binary sensors, and automations and scripts. But we're going to come back to those in just a second. You can see I've already got a couple of include statements here, which are generally created for you if you use the UI editor to create your automations or scripts. I'm going to start out by just splitting out my binary sensors. Now, there are only a couple of them here, but I could be adding them over time, so I'm going to go ahead and split these out. First thing I need to do is I need to create a new file to hold the split configuration for binary sensors. So I can come over here to my file editor, and I can simply create a new file. I'll just call mine binarysensors.yaml and click OK. I can now open up this new file, and I've already added a comment here that it's going to be all my global or system-wide binary sensors. Now I need to copy everything that's underneath this from my configuration.yaml file into this new file. Now there is one thing to note here. Remember that I talked about the importance of indentation with YAML of always being two spaces. Well, when you actually split this out and use an include statement, when Home Assistant merges these back together, it's going to insert these two spaces back for you. So when I move this over here, I need to first remove these two spaces. For me in this particular text editor, I can just simply use Shift-Tab to remove those two spaces. Now I can cut this out of my configuration.yaml, come over here and paste it into place. Now the other thing I need to do is I need to come back over here to my main configuration.yaml, and I need to tell it to include this new file that I've created. So I'll do an include and the name of the file, binarysensors.yaml. Now it is possible to put these things into directories, and I'll talk a little bit about that when we get the automations and scripts, but that's really all there is to it. Now I can save this new file and save the changes to my default configuration.yaml file. When you are first starting out, I do recommend that you do this a step at a time. So after you've moved that first integration, in my case my binary sensors, I do want to go ahead and come over here to my developer tools and check my configuration to make sure I'm not seeing any errors. I also personally like to go ahead and go into my system and check my logs to make sure I don't see anything there as well. If I do, I can go ahead and clear those out to make sure that my changes aren't causing any issues. But now what we need to do is really, anytime you touch anything in the main configuration.yaml file, it's a good idea to do a restart of Home Assistant. Once we have these things split out and we make changes to them later, we can easily just upgrade parts like our binary sensors or our input booleans. But for now, since we changed the configuration.yaml, I'm going to go ahead and do a restart of Home Assistant. Okay, now that Home Assistant is restarted, I'm once again just going to go check my system logs just to make sure that there's nothing that showed up there that caused a problem on the restart. Then I'm going to go into my states and I'm going to look for a couple of those binary sensors that I moved. And there they are. So they're still loading, they're still working properly after I split them out into their own YAML file. So now we've moved the first integration of binary sensors. Now we can go back to our configuration.yaml and repeat that process for other integrations. Okay, back over in the configuration.yaml file, we've got the binary sensors moved. So now I can just move right on down my list. So again, for my cameras, I will come over. I'm going to create a new file, call this cameras.yaml. Okay to that. Now I'm going to open that file, come over here, highlight everything that's underneath my camera integration, remove the two spaces, cut it out of here, paste it into here, come back over here and put in my include cameras.yaml, save both files, check my configuration, and restart Home Assistant. One other nice feature of having your own split configuration files is that you can easily add comments and documentation without fear of Home Assistant overriding it like it does with some of the UI generated files. So as you continue splitting things out, you're going to notice your configuration.yaml file becoming much shorter and much more organized and easy to read. And now you have all of these individual integrations split out into their own files over here. Now do note that you don't have to split everything out. You can live with part of it split out and part of it remaining in your configuration.yaml. You can see down here, I have not split out climate. I certainly could, but I only have one entity underneath there, so I didn't split it out into its own YAML file. You may also have integrations that don't have anything underneath them. I could split these out into an empty YAML file, but it's really not necessary. If I ever do come back and add more than one or two entities underneath any of these, then I would definitely consider splitting that out into its own YAML file and using an include statement. But do note that you don't have to do this all at one time, or only split out things that have lots of entities and leave the rest of them in your configuration.yaml file. But next I want to talk about how you can get a little bit fancier by creating directories with multiple files that you can do in an include statement. And this is going to most likely apply to things like automations and scripts. When it comes to automations, if you use the Home Assistant UI editor to create any automations, Home Assistant has already split that out for you. You'll see that there's already an automations.yaml file and an include statement in your configuration.yaml file. While this is great, there are a few drawbacks to this. For one thing, you really shouldn't edit this automations.yaml file. You might not be able to go back and edit it in the UI editor if you do. And it's going to put all of your automations into this one file. So like your original configuration.yaml file, this can end up being thousands of lines long, and it really isn't organized in any kind of order. And while the UI editor continues to get better and better all the time, there are still a few things when it comes to some advanced automations that you can't do through the UI and you have to do in YAML. Or maybe you want to import some automations from somebody else, like some of my projects that are done in YAML. While it is possible to create multiple YAML files of the same type like automations and include those in your configuration.yaml, I'll show an example of that. If you're going to put all of your automations into one file, again, it could become thousands of lines long and really may not be the best way to organize things. But there is a different way that we can organize our automations and things like scripts and break those down even further. So we can have all of our individual YAML files here in the default config folder, or I think it's been renamed Home Assistant folder, in our configuration. But the one thing we could do is we can actually add a folder. And inside of that folder, we can put as many YAML files as we want, in this case for automations. This allows you to organize and group your automations in a way that makes sense to you. So for example, I have a group of automations around my main basement lights. That's in its own YAML file. I have other automations for things like batteries or Christmas. Each of these YAML files can contain a single automation or groups of automations, however you best want to organize them. And you can also include comments and documentations within these files without fear of them being overwritten by the UI editor. So how do you go about doing this? Okay, back over here in our editor, remember we used this to create a new file? Well, right next to that is an option to create a new folder. So we come in here and give our folder whatever name we want. Again, since this is a folder, not a file, you probably don't want to put the .yaml extension on there, but we can add a folder to our default Home Assistant configuration directory. I've already got an automations folder here, and if I open this up, you'll see I already have one YAML file here of automations. But just like we did before, I can create a new file. I'll just call this one matrix.yaml. And if I open that file, now I can move my automations just like I did any other types of integrations or entities. I'll come over here, I'll highlight a group of automations that I want to move out of my main configuration file. And just like before, I will remove those two leading spaces. And now I can simply cut this out of here, come over here and paste it into place. What do we do about the include statement back over in our main configuration.yaml file? We already have an include statement for automations, which are those generated by the UI, and we want to keep that. Normally, you can't duplicate an integration across all of your configuration. We can't have two automations like this. But if we want to include multiple files, you can give a second or even a third include statement by giving each one a unique identifier. And we can call this anything we want. We can call it automations custom, or we can call it automation split, just so it has a unique identifier over the one that includes the UI generated YAML. But also, we don't want to just include a single file in this case. We want to include multiple files that were in that directory or that folder that we created. So in this case, we use a different include statement. We use something called include dir merge list. This says take everything that was in this directory and merge it into one file, and all of those files contain lists. Back when I talked about YAML, I talked about the differences between lists and mappings or directories. Remember that the list always started with a hyphen in front of each entity. So in this case, my automations are lists. So I'm going to use include dir merge list, and then I'm going to give it just the folder name. And it's going to take all of those various YAML files of my automations in there, merge those together into one list, and include it as part of my automations. If you do want to create a folder with multiple files of something that are dictionaries or mappings, an example of this would be scripts, which are mappings instead of lists, we can simply use a different include statement, include dir merge named. That indicates that everything we're going to merge together, those multiple YAML files, are going to consist of dictionaries or mappings as opposed to lists like with automations. So if we use an include with just a single file name, that means we want to include that, and that YAML file is going to contain one or more entities of a particular integration type, whether that be input booleans or lights, switches, MQTT, whatever the particular integration is, and those can be lists or dictionaries. We can use dir merge list if we want to merge multiple YAML files together. Each contain a list of a particular integration. So this again would be merging together entities that are list items and have that hyphen starting each one. We can use dir merge name when we want to do the same thing, but the entities we want to merge together in our separate YAML files are all dictionaries or mappings. Now there are a couple of other options here that I'm not going to get into where we can use individual entities within a file and merge those in. If you want to know more about those options, check the video description. I'll leave a link to the Home Assistant documentation. One final little tip or trick here. If you really like the idea of organizing things like your automations and scripts in this manner, but you're still somewhat new to Home Assistant and really aren't comfortable writing your own YAML from scratch, well, you can use the UI editor to generate the YAML for you, take that YAML, and then move it into whatever folder or file structure you like to keep things organized. In Home Assistant, we can use the UI editor to create a new automation. Go ahead and create the automation using the UI editor. So put in your triggers and your conditions and your actions. But before you save the file, come up to the three dots and say Edit in YAML. There is the YAML for this automation. So what we can do is we can actually take this and we can copy it. But then you don't want to save this automation, because what's going to happen is if you're going to move this to your own YAML and you save it, you're going to end up with 2 copies of the same automation. So we'll go back to the visual editor and we will just go back and we will leave this without saving it. Now we can simply create or open up any one of our existing automation.yaml files, and we can paste that YAML from the editor into our own YAML file. Now do note that since we didn't save this, this doesn't have an alias or a name yet, and notice I've got the little red exclamation mark up here. Well, remember, automations are lists, so we need to have that hyphen. So that also means we need to take all of this and we need to indent it by those 2 spaces. Now I can come up here, add my hyphen for my list indicator, and give this an alias or a name. I'll just call this my test. And now you see I've got the green check mark. I can save this, and I've taken the YAML from that UI editor and moved it into my own location in my own YAML structure. And do note that since this is now in our own YAML file and not the default UI editor YAML file, we can do things like add documentation or rearrange the order of the automations or anything else we like without worry about the UI editor overriding those. Now, theoretically, you could have gone ahead and saved that automation through the UI editor, then open up the default automations.yaml, try to find that automation and move it out of here into your own YAML file. But that can be risky. First of all, you would want to copy it, go back to the UI editor and delete it so you don't end up with any orphaned entities. And it's also possible that you could mess up this file and cause you problems with your other UI generated automations. As the Home Assistant documentation says, this automations.yaml file is really not meant to be edited. Now do note, using either method means you're not going to be able to edit that automation later on using the UI editor. You can only edit automations that are in this particular file. But by doing this and starting to look at the YAML that's generated by the UI editor will help you start to understand YAML a little bit better, and maybe lead you to the point where you can start writing your own automations and scripts in YAML from scratch. That provides you with the basics of how to split your configuration file. Now, there are a lot of different ways to do this. Individual files like I showed, or you can create directories or folders and group your files underneath that. You can group things by device type or a particular room in your home, or however you decide you want to organize them. In my next Home Assistant video, I'll show you yet another way to organize your configuration, and that's through the use of Home Assistant packages. But until that time, as always, I would like to say thank you for watching, and I hope to see you soon.